Welcome to the first podcast by Iridial Zen, and we are talking about social change, sociocultural evolution, and the equilibrium. Now, social change and sociocultural evolution sound similar but are very different because social change is a description, a generic idea of, say, one place or a social group going through an economic change or a political change or a social change without any sort of description of what these particular structures or microstructures are doing to interact and to cause these changes. Sociocultural evolution, on the other hand, though not always addressing the structures, still addresses social progress holistically in large chunks of time, and also addressing socioeconomics, sociopolitics, so addressing all the various disciplines. And for that reason, sociocultural evolution has become a methodology rather than just a source of literature, and has more scientific implications. And just as other sciences, in these points of studies, you find that they went through several stages. I mean, sociocultural evolution has been, the point of wonder and curiosity for academics as well as ancient philosophers. So you see the kind of time frame that is being addressed here. And so it went from classical, modern, and then to ecological. And it started with a stadial theory of sociocultural evolution, talking less descriptively about the stages that human progress or social progress has been through. But it did not have any kind of description. It did not hold any kind of analysis of what geographical location we are talking about, what this particular social group was, but it was just statement like social progress went from primitive to modern. And you can't know much about any social group if the approach is like that. So although this particular era was fundamental in forming the basis of social sciences, you found that there is no explanation as to why primitive societies exist in modern times and why advanced civilization existed in ancient times. So there's no sort of specific data available. Though people like John Dewey and Jean-Jacques Rousseau or John Locke or Thomas Hobbes tried to address these particular theories effectively, it was the unilineal theory in the Renaissance times that basically set the stage for what was to come forth in ethnography and anthropology and modern sociology. And these unilineal theories encompassed European thinkers talking about industrial revolution, post-Renaissance era, colonial era, imperial era, world wars even, and using these sort of events in those times to address the status of sociocultural evolution, also trying to address and study past civilizations in order to speculate where social progress was heading. So Auguste Comte basically divided human progress and social progress into three stages. It was the law of three stages, as he called it: theological, metaphysical, and positivist. Now, these three stages are not very descriptive, and although for him theological is basically adhering to religion and spirit, and metaphysical being more like family and interpersonal, and then positivist being more rational and scientific, it doesn't really explain much about several civilizations interacting with each other, forming the large chunk of world societies, global societies. And so there was a need to divide and to sort of elaborate on these three stages that Comte had developed. And so religious theories regarding sociocultural evolution were developed by Durkheim and Weber alike. And so it says that magic and spirit were the early stages, and then revitalization, or metaphysical, as Comte calls it, and then societies became more organized. Weber has called it the progress from polytheism to monotheism to ethical monotheism. Now, magic and spirit can adhere to some kind of mysticism, as you find in various tribes, in Native American tribes, in Australian tribes today. And then revitalization is the reinstated existence of religion, but in a more sort of modern sense. So you find that religion is used for power, it's used for economics, it's used for some kind of gain in the world, because that's how the world was. And so you find it in the Bhakti movement in India, as there were Mughal invasions. You find it in the sort of Christian missionary movement, and so on and so forth. And then it became more organized. So using religion as a backdrop for understanding socio-cultural evolution, you realize that it later became more form of an organized religion, where ideas and philosophies and doctrines were established, and there was a need to use those as guiding points. Now, Lewis Henry Morgan has used technological theories. He was an anthropologist, so he studied the Iroquois Eskimos, and so basically he used savagery and barbarism and civilization in order to explain sociocultural evolution. And he used the tools that civilizations were using and the means that they were using to gain control in order to explain sociocultural evolution. So early man was a savage, and then when they started to conquer and they started to cause bloodshed and everything, they became barbaric, and then they became civilized, though it doesn't explain how civilization still includes barbarism and savagery. And then there were economic theories by Adam Smith, which were adhering to an economic backdrop, meaning that man was a hunter-gatherer, then he became a pastoral farmer, and then it went to the era of commerce. So most of these theories stop before the First World War, and also use Industrial Revolution as a sort of key map line for explaining the things. But it had its limitations because they were often deemed ethnocentric, meaning that you were using the anthropologists basically, or Lewis Henry Morgan and his peers were using the types of tribes that are present today in order to, as reference points basically, in order to explain perhaps where we may have been. And so the criticisms involve things like, well, some of these tribes also developed over time, and so how could we say that the tribes that we see today in the way they work, their economies and their politics and their technologies, and say that that is how we were? And so it was very ethnocentric, and it received a lot of criticism. And so modern theories developed, and we'll talk about it in Equilibrium when we address Talcott Parsons, but modern theories tried to escape ethnocentrism, tried to escape value judgments, and were more subjective theories. So it was still using generic guidelines, but it was the attempt to use more sort of subjective points, focal points, in order to explain social progress and evolution. So Robert Redfield used folk society and urban society to compare early men and modern men. Gordon Childe called Neolithic Revolution and Urban Revolution two big points of history and society, calling the modern man more of an extension of an urban revolution. Marshall Sahlins used general evolution and specific evolution, which addressed the problem that Lewis Henry Morgan perhaps couldn't address. So Marshall Sahlins were talking about generic evolution, which takes place to societies as a whole and different diverse set of societies as a whole. So say a famine or an economic problem or something like that will affect society as a whole. And then specific evolution will affect specific tribes. So say there is a pastoral tribe, and then there is a tribe that relies on agriculture, And if there is a shortage of crops, then the pastoral tribe will not necessarily be affected by it. The agricultural tribe will be affected by it. So that was general evolution, specific evolution. Now, again, this was the world that lived in. So they were trying to revitalize human morality at this point. They were trying to address human reality and progress through the lens of something that also superseded the evils of the World War, that World War One and Two, and the sort of bloodshed and inhumanity that existed around this time. And so all these theories were more humanistic, more holistic, more moralistic. But they were not scientific, according to some people. And so the focus on environment increased around this time. Focus on ecology and surroundings increased, meaning that somebody like Julian Stewart said that it was essential to understand Darwin's point of view about adaptation and survival of the fittest in order to understand how societies evolved. So basically, adaptation set the stage for societies to make decisions, or for individuals to make decisions about their subsistence patterns, about their economies, about their politics. And that is how societies evolved. So he came up with human ecological theory that focused on surroundings and its effects on man. And so he looked at parallel adaptations. He looked at parallel adaptations of different societies going through different geographical conditions, different environmental issues, going through different challenges basically, and those as the precursors to how these societies have evolved and developed and established themselves. And that's how modern society has established itself. So that brings me to the last segment of this podcast, the equilibrium. The equilibrium is the stability or a continuity pertaining to something. And Talcott Parsons used it to describe change and stability in society. And so there is an equilibrium of society that can go through deviation periods. And if a change happens, then either this change is adjusted to by the rest of society, or this change reverts back to status quo. And sociologists or ethnographers or anthropologists or historians use this transitional period between the onset of a change and its point of being reverted, or the society getting adjusted. And so obviously social equilibrium is only related to slower changes and gradual processes than static shifts and sudden changes. And so World War II can have social equilibrium, to explain the various events surrounding it. So World War II was a slow process. It was a gradual event that unfolded. It was a gradual catastrophe. And so the various changes, economic and socio-political, socio-cultural, taking place during the World War can be explained in social equilibrium. COVID-19 can be used in social equilibrium, because the various guidelines and the lockdowns and the social norms that were presented after the onset of this particular pandemic basically gave rise to a situation where people had to adjust. People had to come to normalcy, as we say. This is normalized, and so on and so forth. And so you find that now that the COVID situation has reverted back to normal, the various changes that took place, the various technological demands that happened, the various ways that we conducted our affairs has largely remained the same. And so this study comes from the transitional period around this time. So what does explain static changes, sudden changes? That would be the punctuated equilibrium in culture. Something that studies these shifts that are so sudden that they cause spikes in various stages and domains of human life. So punctuated equilibrium studies things like natural disasters, earthquakes and flooding, which to a layman is normally not known. Now it's predicted, obviously, science has really changed the suddenness of certain natural disasters, that's for sure. But they cannot be predicted uh, in history. And so early disasters or even man-made disasters or even nuclear disasters gave rise to a lot of static changes. And catastrophe is the major concern with punctuated equilibrium of culture. So World War II and coronavirus cannot be studied in punctuated equilibrium because they are gradual changes. They are things that people generally expected. And so punctuated equilibrium largely depends on how sudden a particular event is for individuals in a social group. So we are addressing very psychological boundaries here. Acts of violence like terrorism and shootings are not predicted and so can cause static shifts. Things like police violence, as we call it, the George Floyd murder or the school shootings, they cause sudden shifts, changes. They cause cultural changes. They cause ripples in the pattern of the things and the ways that we conduct ourselves. Financial crisis can have punctuated equilibrium and collective response pertaining to financial crisis, pertaining to economical crisis. The market crashes of 2008, 1930 were basically laying ground for static shifts that would happen in politics, economics, and the way people looked at things, consumerism and market and business and whatnot. Now, adversely, voluntary movements can cause ripples in political and social structures in punctuated equilibrium of culture. So basically we studied events happening around people. So this is again human ecology, Julian Stewart, an extension of that domain of study in sociocultural evolution. But if you really look at it, just as things in the surroundings and just as things in the environment affect us, humans can affect the way things are being administered around them. Humans can basically dictate how political structures, economic structures, legislature can basically work or function. And so I call this the inverted theory of punctuated equilibrium in culture, where basically the administrative bodies and the government become the individuals or the members of the group, and citizens become the agents of suddenness. And so revolutions and protests and uproars are basically the sources of this. They are the agents, they are the chaos that can force administrations and governments to change laws, social norms, and the infrastructure. And this is pertaining to the modern world today. Yes, there is an existence of oppressive, authoritative states and leaders all over the world. But the modern world basically works in favor of both sides of the story, the punctuated equilibrium as well as the inverted punctuated equilibrium. And so in the science age, in the age of Instagram, revolution, uproar, and protest become easier. They become easier in giving people a voice, giving social groups a voice, which can cause a punctuated equilibrium in order for the laws and the legislatures to modify to fit the needs of the people. And so that was inverted theory, punctuated equilibrium of culture, and not been studied vastly, but say the last 30 years, study of policy and economy and sociopolitics has given rise to these studies. And obviously there is more to this than what's being presented and seen today. Thank you for listening, and Iridial Zen will be coming up with more podcasts about topics that normally in writing or just in videos cannot be addressed effectively. So this is the new medium that I want to use to present deeper ideas and deeper theoretical concepts in all the domains: philosophy, history, sociology, anthropology, archaeology, geography, you name it. Thank you.